Right, so recording is in progress. Let's wait for people to start coming in. Yeah, we've got a couple of people in. Welcome, James. Right. Hi, everybody. We're just setting up now. I mean, we're technically set up. We're just waiting for people to come in now. We're just going to give everybody 5 minutes for those who are just joining us now, or might be joining us later as well. So just relax for a fiver. Good afternoon. Hello. Hi, Beth. Hi, Paul. Hi, Rosalind. So for those who didn't hear, we're just going to give a few more minutes to see if people are still joining us. For those who are here, can you hear us okay? Can you see the slides? If you can, just type it on the in the chat box if everything's working for you.
Better just check that you can all hear me as well. Hi, everybody.
Yeah, lovely. All right, thank you. Great. Amazing. As well, everybody can see it. Yeah. Okay, just a little bit more, guys, and then we'll I think we'll be good to start. Okay. Welcome. Thanks for joining us. Okay, I think we're going to kickstart the webinar, and then hopefully some more people might be able to join us along. But so thank you everybody for being here. So my name is Nuno, and I'm the operations manager for the Dyslexia Association of London. And today we're having a webinar with Mike Woodward on all things access to work, which is a topic that we was highly requested through our helpline and through our support group that we hold monthly in London. So today we have the pleasure of having Mark with us today to talk a bit more about access to work. So so we'll have Mark sort of doing a presentation, and then we will be holding a questions and answers session at the end. So if you've got questions, you can type them throughout the webinar, but we'll only address them at the end. So just type it in as they come, and we'll answer them at the end. So Mark, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Nuno. Hi, everybody on this toasty, warm Friday afternoon. My name's Mark Woodward, and we're going to have a bit of a deep-ish dive into this thing called access to work. So first of all, let me just introduce myself briefly. So I've worked in the area of diversity and sort of a wider disability for a long time now, 13, I think, yeah, at least 13 years. And I've got a couple of different hats that I wear day-to-day life. I'm a consultant, so I work with organisations on a higher level, looking at policies, inclusiveness, reasonable adjustments, and that type of thing. And I also work on an individual level with employees as a workplace needs assessor, as a coach, and I'm also a coaching supervisor as well. So lots of different hats that I wear. I work for a company called Neurobox, who work with organisations, and we do an awful lot of work with access to work. And we get asked many questions from the organisations and the employees that contact us. Absolutely everything from will I have to pay anything to am I eligible, all these sorts of things. And I'm hoping that going through this today, we can address some of these questions and hopefully many more as well. So off at the beginning, and let's what is access to work? Somebody referred to access to work the other week to me as the government's best kept secret, and it is still really surprising to me how many organisations, people still don't even know what access to work is or that it even exists. But very simply, it's basically a government pot of money. It's a publicly funded grant to support disabled people to both start and stay in work. And the way that it does that is to financially support the employee and the employer with support and adjustments that the employee may need in the workplace. Okay. And that can be absolutely anything from a piece of software to a more ongoing type of support, like a PA, for example, or a sign language reader type of thing. So absolutely all sorts of support. And this is really important because most employees know that they have a legal obligation to make reasonable adjustments for disabled employees. But employers, with the best will in the world, can't be experts in all different types of disability. So left to their own devices, the sorts of adjustments that might get implemented may be fairly limited. They may well ask the employee what they would like implemented, and the employee may or may not know the answer, especially if they're new to the role or even new to work. So putting reasonable adjustments in place is one thing. Knowing what those reasonable adjustments are is another thing. And that's one of the areas in which access to work is great, because they have a whole army of assessors, expert assessors, who know all about various different types of disability. They are the ones that will make the suggestions for adjustments, reasonable adjustments that an employer might consider. Okay. So from an employer point of view, this is great because it helps them, it supports them to meet their legal obligations under the Equality Act. But obviously, of course, it's a great thing because it supports the whole equal access to employment for everybody. So that's what access to work is and sort of why it exists, if you like. Trying to get my slide to move on. There we go. So let's just talk a little bit about who's eligible for this pot of money, if you like. Okay, who can access this pot of money? And it's really quite simple. Basically, absolutely anyone who has a disability or long-term health condition, okay, that falls within the legal definition of a disability. And the legal definition of a disability is essentially, very, very briefly, anything that has a long-term substantial effect on a person's ability to do day-to-day tasks. Long-term means 12 months or more. Substantial is a really interesting one. I actually looked up the legal definition of the word substantial in the context of the Equality Act, and the best answer I got back was substantial means not insubstantial. So we tend to find that lots of wording and legislation around the Equality Act and reasonable adjustments is very grey and fuzzy. And I kind of get why that needs to be, because it has to apply to a whole range of situations and organisations, but it doesn't help people who are trying to do the right thing. But anyway, that's the definition of a disability. And is neurodiversity a disability? Is something we get asked quite a lot, okay? And the answer is most definitely yes, okay, because it ticks the boxes. Is it long-term? Yes, it's not going to go away. And does it have a substantial effect? It certainly can do, okay? Neurodiversities like dyslexia, for example, ASD, they are specifically mentioned in the Equality Act. So yes, neurodiversity does fall under the disability banner, okay? And I'm speaking from a position of someone who's neurodiverse themselves. I don't consider myself disabled, and I certainly wouldn't refer to myself as disabled. But for the purposes of the Equality Act, I kind of have to swallow that and say, actually, okay, fine, I do fall into that definition. Does access to work help with anything other than disability? And actually, yes, it does. Okay, and this is a fairly recent thing for access to work. It's been going for a couple of years now. But access to work will provide mental health support as well. Okay, it's essentially a separate service to the access to work assessments and adjustments service, but they've partnered up with a couple of companies who will help anyone who feels they may need some support with their mental health. Okay, whether that's about losing your job, whether it's about managing in your role, or even going through the interview process. Okay. Good. I was going to ask if anybody's got any questions there, but please just feel free to jot them down, okay? Now, as you'd expect, being a government-funded scheme and a government pot of money, there are some, okay, but actually, they're not terrible. You need to be 16 or over. Well, if we consider that this is essentially an access to work provision, that's probably not too unreasonable. You need to be in or about to start paid employment. Okay, about to start is interesting as well, because actually you do not need to have started that role. In an ideal world, adjustments will be in place for you for when you start on day one. Okay, in the real world, very rarely happens. But this also does include self-employment too. Okay, so you do not have to be employed by somebody, you can be self-employed. You need to be in England, Scotland, or Wales. You may not, and it's a big may not, get access to work if you're receiving benefits, for example, incapacity benefit and a few others. It's very, very easy, and the general advice is to go through the process and talk to Access to Work about that, because it's by no means a black and white line. Trainees and interns are also eligible, but they must be part of a recognised trainee intern scheme. Okay, so we can't just set up an imaginary one. It has to be part of a formal Department of Education recognised scheme. Your funding may be limited if you're regularly working outside of the UK, England, Scotland, or Wales. Okay, again, not too unreasonable. And the other one, the big one, is that if you are a civil servant, if you work for any government departments, then actually Access to Work is not available to you. Okay, there's a whole other scheme, but not Access to Work. And those are kind of it, really. Those are the restrictions. Let's have a look at what type of support you might expect to receive if you go through the Access to Work route. And it's an interesting one, because when we talk about reasonable adjustments at work, or workplace adjustments, whatever we want to term it as, they can refer to absolutely anything that's there to support us. It could be a piece of technology, a piece of software. It could simply be some flexibility around your working hours. It simply could be perhaps some additional breaks, maybe not having to take meeting notes in a meeting. These are all reasonable adjustments that an employer under the Equality Act should be considering. However, it's important to point out that Access to Work will only make suggestions for which they provide funding. Okay, so typically they tend to be the things that organisations have to pay for and buy in. Things like assistive technology, adapting existing equipment. They'll provide money towards transport to and from work if for any reason you can't get public transport. Money towards extra travel costs that you might have to do within your work. Support for job interviews, actually, and that's really, really interesting, because what this means is that you don't have to be in work. If you've got a job interview lined up, you can apply for Access to Work for support within that interview process. That may be a British Sign Language reader, for example. Okay, it could include support workers. That might be, as I said, a sign language interpreter or a personal assistant. It will also be services like coaching, job coaching, certainly for people who are neurodifferent, is quite a regular recommendation, and it's a really important adjustment to make. And I'm speaking, I've got a personal interest in that because I work as a coach, but also things like training, whether that's training on some specific software that you may have been given to help you in your role, or whether it's awareness training for your managers or colleagues. All of those sorts of things will potentially be offered and funded by Access to Work. Okay. As I said, what you might not find in the report, which I'll mention again in a moment, are general things that the organisation can do that don't necessarily involve a cost. Things like making working allowances, working practices, and that type of thing. Another question we get asked a lot is, as the employee, will I have to pay anything? Okay, and the really simple answer is no, quite honestly. I've never known anyone who is an employee applying for Access to Work have to provide any funding whatsoever. Okay, there is an exception. I've never seen it practiced, but there is an exception that says that if you'll also get a benefit from whatever it is that's provided to you outside of work, you may have to contribute toward the costs. Okay. But generally speaking, no. As the employee, as the person applying for the Access to Work grant, you do not have to pay anything. It is, however, a little bit different for the organisation, for the employer, okay, because they may well have to pay something. And this is where the Access to Work scheme gets a little bit complicated, okay? So I'll do my best to explain, to ask questions afterwards if I haven't done a very good job of it. So generally speaking, the employer will not have to pay anything towards these costs if you've just been given the job, basically. If you've been employed for less than 6 weeks, when you apply for Access to Work, there is no contribution from your employer needed, okay? There is also no contribution for any of the mental health support services that they may put in there as well, okay? However, your employer may have to make a contribution if you've been employed for more than 6 weeks when you apply. And this is where it gets a little bit complicated, okay? Because how much an employer contributes toward the cost of these adjustments will depend on the size of the organisation. So for what's normally termed as a small organisation, up to 4 people, the employer pays less. So essentially they will pay 20%, a fifth of the whole costs of everything. Okay, so if you've got a piece of software and you've got some training on it, and you might have a sort of another piece of equipment to help you out, it might come to, say, for argument's sake, a couple of £1,000. Well, the employer will be expected to pay 20% of that. That's capped at £10,000. Okay. Any costs over £10,000 will be entirely down to Access to Work. Never really, well, no, that's not true. I have, but very rarely come up against any adjustments that come to more than £10,000. For a medium-sized organisation, 50 to 249, it's a little bit more. Okay, that organisation still has to pay 20% of all the costs up to £10,000, but they've also got to pay an additional £500 to. For large organisations, again, exactly the same, but the employer has to pay an additional £1,000 of all the costs. Okay. And that's kind of it, really. Now, once you get to a large employer position, that £1,000 initial cost, if you like, that they have to pay may actually be more than the adjustments themselves are worth. And we find this quite a lot. We find that lots of large employers actually choose to bypass Access to Work because actually the funding they receive is fairly minimal, knowing that they have to pay the first £1,000, but also the process requires quite a lot of, let's say, red tape, jumping through hoops. And so for large organizations, it's not unusual for them to take the decision that actually we'll just manage this process privately ourselves. Okay, that may happen. But generally speaking, certainly for small or medium employers, Access to Work is a great way to go. But remember, if you've been employed for less than 6 weeks, nobody has to pay anything. Okay. Now, how does the funding actually work? So the way that the process works, and I'm going to dive a little bit more into the process itself in a moment, but just for now, the way the funding works is that the employer has the responsibility to go and purchase everything that the Access to Work assessor has suggested for this particular employee. Okay. Now, the important thing here is that the employer does not have to provide everything that suggested or recommended. It's always up to the employer to decide whether something is a reasonable adjustment or not. Okay. So just because it's in an Access to Work report as a recommendation doesn't necessarily mean the employer has to provide it. Okay. They'd be a bit silly not to, especially considering that it's funded, but that's an important point to make. Anyway, so the employer goes and purchases everything that's in the report, and they can buy that from anywhere they want. The assessment report that you as the employee will receive from Access to Work will detail all the things that the assessor thinks might help you, and it will also detail where you can purchase these things from and an amount. Okay. Now, there's very little consistency in those supplier recommendations. It really does depend on that specific assessor. Some employers simply choose to follow the assessment report and just purchase things from the recommended places. Other employers find it a little bit onerous to set up lots of new suppliers on their database and have lots and lots of different new accounts to sort of manage and track. So they'll choose just to purchase it all from one supplier who can provide everything. Other organizations may have their own suppliers already who can provide this stuff, so they'll just go and do that. The employer can buy it from wherever they want, but Access to Work will only fund the amount that's on that report. Okay. So anyway, the employee goes off and buys all the equipment in. The employer usually then has about 6 months to claim that money back. And to claim back, it is actually not necessarily a straightforward process, because there are at least one, normally 2 forms that have to be filled out to claim that money back. And they have to be sent off again to Access to Work, who will then refund that money. Now, you can't email it. There's no website to go to. You have to print the forms out, fill them out manually, and physically post them with a physical copy of the receipt and invoice to an address. Okay. That said, Access to Work are actually pretty good at getting the money paid over quite quickly. One little thing to note is that for many people who are self-employed, being able to go out and purchase £1,000, £2,000, £3,000 worth of equipment and then claim the money back is sometimes just not viable for them. Okay, so in the circumstances, Access to Work are actually really, really good. And they are, I think, more frequently, we're certainly finding it more frequently now, funding it first. So they will pay for it directly rather than you having to pay and then claim back. Okay. We've seen that quite a lot for people who are self-employed, certainly over the last sort of 12 months. So that's how the funding actually works. Let's have a bit of a deep dive into an Access to Work journey. So we're going to sort of follow a fictional person through this whole process and have a really good look at it. Okay, so this person has realized that actually they may be finding it difficult in their role. They may be starting a new role. They know that they have a disability. Let's say, for argument's sake, well, let's say they're dyslexic, shall we? So where do they start? Well, starting the journey is actually really, really quite straightforward. There's a website, there's a phone number, there's a text phone number as well. So it's designed to be quite accessible. And the first step, we're going to follow this fictional person called Charlie. I'd forgotten I'd given them a name. Charlie, apparently. Okay. That's a nice gender neutral name as well. Perfect. Okay. So we're going to start at the very, very top. Okay. So Charlie's just started a new role. Charlie has suspected ADHD. Okay, that's fine. Could have been dyslexic, but no formal diagnosis. Now, Charlie's concerned how this might affect their new role, and as he wants the best chance of success, he decides to go and talk this through with his new manager. Now, Charlie's manager is all clued up and knows Access to Work, so directs Charlie off to the Access to Work website. And that's quite an interesting point, because the Access to Work journey is designed to be very employee-led. Okay. Now, there's a lot of forms to fill out and there's a lot of chasing up to do. And that isn't always people with dyslexia, ADHD, etc's strength, certainly not mine. Okay, so it's actually not unusual for organizations to support the employee through this process, and that's perfectly okay. Anyway, Charlie visits the website and completes a short-ish form. Okay, and it's a form that really asks for some of the basic details. Where do you work? Why are you claiming? Some of the essentials. Okay. The next step is that Access to Work reach out to Charlie and they arrange a phone call with him, just to go through that he's completed, just to double check the information. And during that call, they'll agree a date and a method for an actual workplace needs assessment. Okay. I've put on there agreeing a date and a method because Access to Work will come out to your place of work if you want to. They will do it remotely via something like Teams or Zoom, or it can be on a telephone call. Okay, they're quite flexible and they'll fit in with what you as the applicant would prefer. So then the date is set for a workplace needs assessment. At the moment, there's a sort of a waiting list of around 3 months, I think, which is much, much better than it was perhaps 2 or 3 months ago when it was around 9 months. Okay. But the Access to workplace needs assessment takes place. Okay. Charlie's opted to do it on the telephone, and it normally lasts around 30 minutes. And the assessor will ask Charlie lots of information about his role and about the areas of his job that are challenging for him. Okay, and then the Access to Work assessor may discuss some of the things that they're thinking of suggesting with Charlie to get Charlie's take on that as well. Okay, and as I said, the process generally takes around half an hour. The next step is that I've put a few days later. It may be a little bit longer than that, but Charlie, as the employee, receives the assessor's report. Okay, and this is the important thing, because that report will summarize their conversation. It will go into a little bit of detail about what his role is and the areas that Charlie might be finding difficult. And then it will go into the suggestions for recommendations or reasonable adjustments for things that they think might support Charlie. And it might be, as we've said before, it might be some software, some training, some coaching. In this particular case, I've got down here that this assessment recommends some software for Charlie, some training on the software, and some coaching to support Charlie in his role as well. Okay, and for each of those suggestions, the report also lists suppliers who can provide them and costs. So then Charlie takes this report off to his manager to go through it, and the manager agrees to implement all of the suggestions, okay, and also to discuss with Charlie if there's anything else that the company could do to support. And this goes back to what I was saying earlier on about that workplace need report is only usually going to recommend things for which there is funding, hence the software, the training, the coaching. It's probably not going to suggest things for Charlie, who is, in this case, ADHD, things like flexibility around breaks, for example, perhaps flexibility around working hours, those types of things, because they don't incur a cost. They do not attract any funding. Okay, so it's still the organization's responsibility to have that conversation with Charlie. But as I said, Charlie's manager is on the ball. He knows this. He's on top of it. The next step is that the company then goes out and it buys all of that suggested equipment, the software, the training, and the coaching. But rather than buying it from their recommended or suggested suppliers, this organization has gone through this Access to Work process before. which is probably why Charlie's manager knows what he's doing. And they've got a supplier that they use regularly for supplying all of their access to work adjustments. So they get the order in. And actually, the nice thing is that because it's all coming from one single source supplier, the organisation only has one claim form to fill out for access to work. Okay. And then over the next few days, the software gets installed on Charlie's machine, and the training and the coaching is arranged with the provider. And the final step is really for the organisation to then fill out the access to work claim form, attach the supplier's invoice for the software, the training and the coaching, and send it off in the post to wait for their money to come through. And that's it. That's the access to work process. I was just going to ask any, but yeah, we'll come to questions. All right, sorry. So that's kind of the access to work process. It's actually not too complicated, and I've been through the process myself. My daughter has recently gone through the process too, and it was quite interesting because I went through it as an employee. My daughter is self-employed, and she went through it as a self-employed person, and it was really, really interesting to see the difference actually. But in both cases, it went quite smoothly. For myself, there was about a 6 to 7 month wait time between me applying and getting the access to work assessment interview. For my daughter, it was a little bit less than that. But as I said, at the moment, it's around 3 months. Okay. But yeah, there we go. And just to sort of just to get the bit in about what we do in this process. So I said we work with access to work, and we work an awful lot with access to work and the access to work assessors, and we fit into this process as a supplier of the adjustments and the recommendations. So we're regularly getting phone calls from access to work assessors and having conversations like, if I recommend this piece of software, would it work in this organization's system because they've got this and that? And we answer technical questions like that. It's also part of our role to keep assessors up to date with all the latest sort of changes and innovations around things like technology and training and coaching. But we're also a one-stop supplier. So if an organization has got one of those assessment reports, they can just come to one place, hopefully us, and we can quote for everything. Where necessary, we will price match. Doesn't happen very often, but we can do that. And we can then all supply it all in one go. And it gives quite a level of security. I mean, it cuts down massively on the paperwork and the administration that the organization has to do, but also it avoids silly things like if you bought the software and the training on that software from the same place, you haven't got to worry about the training being organized for next week, but the software not turning up for 2 weeks. Okay, it's a lot more joined up, if you like. So that's where we fit into the process. I'm not going to hark on too much about that because this is not a sales presentation, but just to let you know, okay? And yeah, that's it. Okay, thank you. And questions now. So if it's okay, what do you suggest, Neil? Shall I stop sharing my screen?
I think you can. That's a nice sort of screen to leave it on. I think
I
we can
will
leave
leave it
that
on that.
slide on. It looks
Perfect.
nice, and you know we'll allow the free real estate for the for the Neurobox. Looks quite nice anyway.
Okay.
So thank you, Mark. I really appreciate that. That was a really, really good in-depth sort of approach to the access to work scheme. And we've got a few questions. So I think we're just going to take them on a first come basis. So we already had a few coming in while you were doing the presentation. And so I'm just going to track back a little bit, and we've got a few. And so we'll start with, let me just double check the timings of these because some of them. All right. So Beth asks, would you know which companies Access to Work have partnered with to support those with poor mental health?
That's a really good question. And the honest answer, Beth, is I did know. But unfortunately, I've slept since I read that and it's gone out of my head now. but I will find out. I think actually, if you were to look on the Access to Work website, it actually does tell you the provider. And I want to say Ingeus. I'm not gonna. I'll find out for you and let you know exactly. Okay, but it's a well-known national organisation that does that.
Thank you, Mark. I'm gonna just quickly link. I'm gonna put the link to the Access to Work scheme. So if anybody is interested, checking it, the page out. So we'll be moving on to the next question. So we got a question from an anonymous attendee, and they're asking, would a chronic illness like celiac classify as a disability or qualify for access to work? And if yes, would a PA be a reasonable change?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it is one we get asked quite a lot. And actually, a few years ago, when I first started out in this, the answer would have been really simple. It would have been a no. Okay, but that's not the case now. Chronic illness is more and more that it falls under the definition of a disability. Okay. Yes, I've worked personally with people who have gone through the Access to Work with a chronic illness. Whether that will affect the funding at all in terms of any other benefits being received, that's a question. But certainly, yes, go through the Access to Work process. I think there's a very good chance that you will get that support. And that goes for other sort of chronic illnesses as well. So things like, for example, fibromyalgia, even things like epilepsy and stuff like that. Access to Work are quite amenable to that.
Thank you, Mark. Okay, so we have Colin, and Colin is asking, let me see if I got this right, because you kind of looks like you've split your question into two, but so yes, do civil servants include public sector workers? And then there's another question, which is, can public sector workers access to work?
Yeah, okay. No, public sector workers are eligible for access to work. Okay, so if you're a social worker or a nurse in the NHS, yes, access to work is available for you. It's specifically for civil servants. And I'm not entirely sure why, if I'm being honest. I'm sure there are perfectly good reasons decided upon by cleverer people than me, but it never really made much sense to me, that one. But there we go. It is what it is. So yeah, if you're a public sector worker, yes, you are eligible for access to work.
Amazing. Okay, so now we have, I'm probably gonna misspell this, but it's Inesilona. So Inesilona asks, after a month in my role, do I still qualify? And then also, do I apply for access to work, or can my workplace? I think you did, there was a slide where it was 6 weeks, isn't it?
Well,
if I paid attention correctly.
if you apply for access to work within the first 6 weeks of employment, then access to work will fully fund everything, and your employer will not have to make any contributions. Okay, that's not to say that you have to apply within that 6 week period. Okay, right. You could have been in your job for 20 years and then apply. Okay, there is no time limit on when you apply. So yes, if you've been in your job for a month, you most certainly can apply for access to work.
So so could you do it? You know, you just sign your contract, for example, and you already know about this, so you just know you want to be on the ball. So the day after you apply for it, is that something that?
And it's a really interesting conversation and topic, because it gets into the whole area of whether or not you feel comfortable disclosing a disability or a neurodiversity when you start. And one of the reasons that the Access to Work have put in this, if you apply within the first 6 weeks, is as an incentive for employers to encourage disclosure. Okay, that on its own doesn't really work, because it's not really up to the employer to make people to disclose. That person has to feel safe before they'll disclose. Absolutely. So from an employer's point of view, it's up to them to create the environment that people feel comfortable starting a new role and going, do you know what, I feel perfectly safe saying I'm dyslexic here. no problem at all. That's great. Okay. Not always the case, certainly with something like dyslexia. And I'm guilty of this myself. I will play, I have done in my past, I've played it safe. And I've accepted a job, and I thought, well, let's just see how I go, because actually, you know, once I get into the role, I'll be fine. I might not have to tell anybody that I'm dyslexic. So there's a lot of that goes on as well. And the other thing is as well, of course, is that you may not know that you're dyslexic or ADHD when you start a role. Many cases that I've personally worked with where people have discovered that they're dyslexic because actually they've been to an awareness session about it because one of their colleagues is dyslexic and go, well, actually, that sounds a lot like me.
Yeah.
So there is definitely no employment time limit on when you can apply for access to work. Okay, it's just that initial 6 weeks is a bit of an incentive for employers to encourage people to disclose.
That sounds great. Yes, it's just like you're saying, sometimes you don't know until you actually engage with certain processes or certain type of work that you haven't been exposed to before. So definitely keep an eye out and just, yeah, to do some research as well if you can. But yeah, be mindful of the kind of work that you're doing and sort of how you react to it as well is very,
Exactly.
important.
And that disclosure and everything, that's a whole other slideshow. So yeah.
Lovely. So I'm picking up on Colin's question, and Colin asks, is there any movement at Access to Work on continuous contact with the neurodiverse employee rather than reapplying every time they change jobs?
Yeah, this is one of the areas where access to work could be a little bit slicker, because it depends whether you're talking about changing jobs within the same organization or not. If you change jobs and go to a different organization, access to work very much leave it up to the organizations. So for example, I've got somebody I'm working with at the moment. Actually, I'm very fidgety today. Sorry about that. I'm working with
It's the heat. It's the heat.
It's definitely the heat, yeah. I'm coaching them at the moment, and they had a number of coaching sessions. There's 18 coaching sessions actually, which is quite a high number. But halfway through our coaching sessions, I think we got to about 7 or 8, I think it was, they changed jobs. They left their employer and went to another job. And their question was, well, can I carry on with my coaching? And so actually we did go to Access to Work and said, well, look, what's the protocol for this? And Access to Work simply said, well, if your existing employer, who has been given the grant and the funding for this, is happy for you to go over there and do it, no problem. Otherwise, we'll need to cancel that one and you'll have to apply again at your new role. Okay. So in my experience, there are very few black and white rules around what happens in this situation. It's a little bit more complex when we're talking about things like software, or even ergonomic chairs and that type of thing, because technically they belong to the organization. Okay, it's the organization that paid for them and they belong to the organization. But the ridiculous thing is that if you were to move jobs and go to a different organization, that organization you've left is probably never ever going to have anyone to use that software again. It's going to sit, the chair's going to sit in the corner gathering dust, and Access to Work are going to have to go and buy you a new one, which absolutely makes no sense at all. But that is kind of the system at the moment. Okay. It's a lot easier if you're changing jobs within the organization, obviously. The other thing I would say as well is that Access to Work isn't a once in a lifetime thing. Okay. You can apply for Access to Work whenever your role significantly changes. Okay. So even if you get promoted and you have a whole new bunch of tasks to do, okay, that might require, for argument's sake, a different piece of assistive software. Okay, you can go back to Access to Work and they will happily have that conversation with you again. They may or may not decide to provide another assessment. Very often it's a conversation, but they are quite amenable to do that. Access to Work is not a once in a lifetime thing.
Right. Thank you, Mark. I see a hand up on Rosalind. Do you mind just typing in, or is that an accidental hand raised that if you've got a question, you just type it in on the chat and we'll happily get back to you. I'm wondering if that was accidental though. Anyway, we'll carry on. So we've got another question with Beth, which so Beth asks, what options are there for people if a person is refused support through access to work, or if an employer refuses to support the application?
Yeah, okay. So it then gets a little bit complicated. So refusal from access to work, honestly, hand on heart, I haven't come across an instance of that, if I'm being honest, but I'm thinking what the process would be. I believe access to work, as far as I know, they do not have an appeals process. Okay. That may well be because they never turn anything down. I don't know. I've certainly not known of anybody being turned down for access to work.
Well, it seems like it's designed. Sorry to interrupt. It's designed to encourage as well, like you were saying, people to get the support needed that they need. So
yeah, what is much more common is for the employer to go, no, we can't do that. I'm sorry, we can't put this piece of software in for all sorts of reasons. And actually, no, we can't do this and we can't do that. Then becomes a little bit more complicated because if you are unable to negotiate with your employer, very often, sometimes your only recourse is to pull out the Equality Act and start having conversations around reasonable adjustments. And that can be a really uncomfortable place to be, especially if you're new in a role. So what tends to happen is that the employee just goes, okay, I'll try and manage anyway, all right, which is a real shame. We have had organizations who have refused, not necessarily for sort of malicious reasons, but simply because they had legitimate concerns around the security of some of the software that was being recommended. Okay, that's relatively easy because we then, assuming the employee reaches out to us, we can then have that conversation with the employer, and we can have quite a technical conversation and sort of, we know that the software is okay, and we can very often work with them to make them feel more comfortable in that. Those are the easy ones. The harder ones are where employers just don't want to do anything, and that can be challenging. Sometimes it's because they don't know how to do things. So often it gets given to somebody to do when they've got a spare minute, and that spare minute never comes, and it falls between the cracks. And it's really on the employee to drive that through, and that's wrong and that's unfair, because very often we're talking about an employee who's neurodiverse, okay, or disabled, and they may feel it very difficult to do that. And as I said before, especially if you're in a new role. So yeah, that's the more frequent challenge, is getting employers on board with these adjustments.
Thank you, Mark. So the next question, actually, before we move on to the next question, I've got Colin, who actually I'm going to track back to his question where he mentioned public sector, but rather than public sector, he should have said local authority.
Oh, right. Okay. No. Local authority do still fall under access to work. Okay. They're not classed as civil servants in terms of access to work. Okay. So if you work for the local council, yes, you are eligible for access to work.
Lovely. And so we've got another question from Anonymous. If you have a part-time / full-time role and freelance work, can you still pay for access to work, or did you mean, do you still have to pay for access to work?
So if you're self-employed, it's very unusual for you to have to contribute anything toward your access to work funding. Okay, that's the first thing. If you're freelance, as far as access to work is concerned, that's the same as being self-employed. All right. If you have a part-time role, yes, you will still be eligible for funding, but it may end up being a separate application or a separate process. Okay. What would make sense is if you were able to go to Access to Work and say, look, I've got these 3, 4, 5 different roles that I do. Okay. The same bunch of adjustments, equipment, or what have you might help me in all of these roles. I would like to think that Access to Work would be clever enough to be able to manage that and go, yeah, okay, fine. In practice, whether that would actually happen or not, I'm not sure. But I think in that case, it would be about filling out the initial questionnaire on the Access to Work application website and explaining that you've got these different roles. It is not going to be the first time that they've come across this situation. Okay. That conversation and the best way to move forward will then happen when you get that follow-up phone call from the assessor.
So, the anonymous corrected, and they meant apply and not pay for. But I think you've answered the question anyway. So,
okay.
All right. So let me just track back a few. So Beth says she got turned down when she applied as a bus driver.
Oh, that's interesting. Oh, okay. Oh, I'd love to know a little bit more about that. Okay, that's very interesting. I wonder if it was that you got. It would be nice to work out whether it was actually turned down or whether they weren't able to make any recommendations. Yeah. Okay. I wish we could have a conversation about that. That would be really, really interesting.
If you've got any more information, Beth, like maybe they've shared any reasons, you feel free to share them. So there's another question from an anonymous attendee, and they say, if I don't feel safe disclosing, can I tell HR instead of management?
That's a really, really good question. I mean, yes, of course you can. The issue is going to be around the organization itself. Okay. And if there is a dedicated HR department, if it's a larger organization, yes, absolutely, you can go to HR and you can tell HR that actually you'd rather not have this information shared with anybody else, and they are to honor that wish. However, if you're applying for Access to Work, at some point, adjustments are probably going to need to be put in place. And it's very difficult to imagine a scenario where your manager wouldn't be aware of that and need to know why they're being put in place. So at some point, I can envisage that you will end up having to disclose to your manager at some point. But certainly, no, you do not have to disclose to your manager. You can disclose to HR. You can say that I don't want anybody else knowing about this. I just want to let you know. And of course, as we all know, there's absolutely no onus on us to disclose at all. You could just go to Access to Work and not tell your employer. Okay. At some point, your employer are obviously going to find out and need to know, because they'll have to put these things in place. But yes, you can just go and talk to HR.
Lovely. Thank you, Mark. So Colin, we've got another one. Colin says, I haven't been turned down assistance, but I have been dismissed before my probation period. It was traumatic, but I got a no-win, no-fee solicitor, and we won a payout until I got a new job. Oh,
good.
So that's more of a sharing.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, and unfortunately, we live in a much more sort of enlightened working world. But yeah, these sorts of stories are still very, very common. I'm sorry you had to go through that, Colin. Yeah, okay. I'm just seeing that Beth's written something there as well about the bus driver. Yeah.
Yeah.
I was told that Access to Work wasn't here to get me free stuff. And bus driving involves shift work and lots of memorization, so I had requested support with this. I've also had a very positive experience with Access to Work. I applied in a different role. That's terrible. That's really, really terrible, Beth. I'm really sorry you had that experience. Yeah, that's obviously wrong. yeah, I'm not sure who told you that Access to Work wasn't there to give you free stuff. I'm assuming that it was the Access to Work, whoever you were talking to, but that's, yeah, I would say that that's a bit of an unusual situation. Yeah, and I'm sorry you had to go through that.
Right. Yeah, sorry, it's sounds a bit unfortunate. So hopefully, maybe if you reapplied, maybe, or could you not in this case sort of appeal and maybe try and get someone else to have a look at the.
Yeah, 13 years ago. Yeah, okay. Well, I'd like to think that things have improved,
Yeah.
but I'm sure that there are horror stories out there, because yeah, unfortunately, that is the world we live in. But I'd like to think that they're few and far between. Thanks for sharing that, Bethel.
Thank you. So there's a question I might just ask it myself. So it's more like for self-employed, for example, what kind of documents would you need? For example, if you were to go through the Access to Work, because obviously if you've got an employer, they'll be able to have all this stuff.
Yeah, yeah. So with Access to Work, essentially what Access to Work are looking for, if you're applying as a self-employed person, is that you are legitimately a self-employed person.
Right.
Okay, so they may ask for things like a copy of your business plan, for example, if you're a newly self-employed. If you've been going for a couple of years, they may ask to see some form of accounts or something like that. Okay, if I go back to my daughter's situation, she was newly self-employed, and all they requested was a copy of business plan, which she emailed across to them, and then that was perfectly sufficient. So that's the sort of thing that they're looking for, isn't it? It's nothing that you wouldn't already have.
Right. Thank you, Mark. And what if there's more of a, like, for example, if I've got friends who are illustrators and you might want to be a freelance illustrator. So what about in that case? Like
What sort of a proof,
would
if
you,
you like, there?
yeah.
Yeah, and again, it's going to be just documentation that can prove that this is a legitimate claim. So it may well be invoices that you sent out to customers.
Yeah, proof of your running business.
Exactly. It may well be copies of freelance of contracts that you might have, something along those lines. Okay. It's not too onerous and it's not too specific. As long as it's something that can satisfy Access to Work, that actually, yes, you are legitimately doing this, that's
Yes.
fine. Yeah.
Lovely. In the meantime, we've got another question in from anonymous attendee, and they're asking, can I suggest what software support I might be interested in? So they're asking for software and support.
Yeah, Access to Work assessors love it when you know what you want. Okay, because it makes their job so much easier. They may just sense check it and might just sort of go through it with you and sort of double check that it is what you want, but absolutely fine. And this happens a lot. So, for example, you may have just left a job where you might have been using text help read and write software, and you know that it works really well for you. So when you go to your new job, you know very well that actually that would really help. And of course, yes, absolutely, they are perfectly open to suggestions.
Great, thank you, Mark. If anybody has any more questions, now is the time. We've already approached 2 o'clock. We're just 3 minutes past, but if I'm happy to just stay for another couple of minutes, if Mark's okay with it, if anybody's got any more questions.
Yeah, happy to.
Yeah.
And also, I'd like to say as well that I'm available at Neurobox. Okay, our emails are over there. If you've got any questions or want to reach out afterwards, please feel free just to get in touch and reach out. Okay, my email's not on there, but it's really simple. It's just mark@neurobox.co.uk. All right.
I'll be sharing the Neurobox websites alongside the DAL website, and we've got a few more resources on it. You were asking about support software. We did a webinar back in January with Mike Pillings on assistive technology, so you might want to check that one to see if you can find out a bit more about the kind of assistive technology that's out there to help you with your dyslexia. And yeah,
there's a lot of it, and there's also a lot of built-in assistive technology into the
yes, already,
stuff that
yeah,
we're already using, more and more actually. But yeah, lots and lots on that. Absolutely.
yeah. Yes, Colin. So once the webinar is finished, we will then do a short edit and we'll be uploading it on the DAL's website. So I'll put the link down. I've already linked the DAL website, but I'll put a link down for the actual webinar page where this one will show up. And once it's been uploaded, and Mark has also been kind enough to share the slides with us, so we'll be uploading it, the slides, so you can revisit it or share it with other people, friends and families, and just rewatch it in case you missed something or you forgot something. But yeah, the resources will be available online. So great. Just double checking if we haven't missed anyone's questions, but I think we've got everyone. And thank you all. You've been very engaging as well with all the questions. I think.
Yeah, I'm definitely going for a lie down now.
Been very good questions. Yeah, I think we're going to give Mark a break now. And been doing a lot of talking. It's been, again, Mark, thank you so much. I think people have really learned a lot about the intricacies of access to work. I've definitely learned a lot more about access to work today than just reading about it. So
Okay, well,
thank you again for accepting.
Thank you for having me and
Yeah.
putting up with me talking for an hour.
Yeah, it's been lovely. It's been music to my ears, and I bet the other people's as well, everybody here. All right, so I think we can bring the webinar to a close now. And thank you everybody. Been you've been excellent attendees. And yeah, so we'll be having another webinar probably in a couple of months because it's a bi-monthly. And in the meantime, you can just keep in touch or keep updated with our social channels where we'll be advertising any future events. So in the meantime, check out Neurobox and get in touch with Mark if you need any more help with access to work or if you've got any questions. And yeah, on that note, I think we can wish you a lovely weekend and enjoy the sunshine. Mark, thank you again.
My pleasure. And yep, have a lovely weekend, everybody.
Lovely. Cheers.
All right.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye now.